Imagine you're standing in your kitchen right now, reaching for a simple plastic container to store some leftovers. You snap the lid into place, feeling that tiny tactile click as the groove of the lid meets the ridge of the container. It's a mindless action. You don't think about the physics of that click, and you certainly don't think of it as a weapon. But that small, mechanical marriage of tension and friction is actually the direct descendant of a technology that allowed your ancestors to conquer the planet without ever having to outrun a single animal. Everything you've been told about how ancient humans survived is probably backwards. We've been fed a diet of Hollywood imagery showing half-naked men sprinting across the savannah, screaming at the top of their lungs, and hurling heavy spears at massive, angry beasts. We've been told that we won the evolutionary lottery because we were the ultimate pursuit predators, the born-to-run marathoners of the animal kingdom. But if that were the only way we hunted, you wouldn't be here to listen to this. The math of a spear chase simply doesn't add up. It's a myth of high-octane drama that ignores the far more impressive, far more chilling reality of the invisible thread. For most of our history, the most successful hunters weren't the ones who ran the fastest. They were the ones who weren't even there when the kill happened. The first and most persistent myth we have to dismantle is the idea that the spear was our primary tool for survival. When you look at the energy expenditure of a pursuit hunt, it is a metabolic disaster. Chasing a deer for 6 hours in the hope that it collapses from heat exhaustion is a gamble that ancient humans couldn't afford to take every single day. One missed throw, one twisted ankle, or one sudden thunderstorm, and the entire caloric investment of the day is gone. That's why the most important tool in the ancient toolkit wasn't a sharp piece of flint on the end of a stick. It was the invisible thread of the trap. A spear is an active weapon that requires your presence, your strength, and your constant attention. A trap is a logical computer made of wood and bone that works while you sleep. It is the first example of human beings outsourcing their labor to the environment itself. By using the invisible thread of logic, the if-this then-that of a trigger mechanism, our ancestors effectively multiplied their presence across the landscape. Why hunt in one place with a spear when you can hunt in 50 places simultaneously with 50 snares? The spear was the exception, the trap was the rule. This brings us to the second myth, the idea that these ancient devices were simple or primitive. We tend to think of a trap as just a hole in the ground or a lucky loop of string, but if you actually look at the engineering involved, it's mind-blowing. Take the Figure 4 deadfall, a design that has been documented in almost every corner of the globe. It uses exactly 3 sticks, but those sticks are carved with such precise geometry that they hold up a heavy stone in a state of supercritical tension. This isn't just a pile of wood, it's a mechanical amplifier. The trigger stick acts as a lever that reduces the weight of a 100-pound rock down to the few grams of pressure required for a mouse or a rabbit to move it. This is sophisticated physics. In 2019, researcher Luis Cordova Barradas and his team at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico discovered something even more massive, the Toltepec mammoth pits. These weren't just random holes. They were engineered traps, nearly 6 feet deep and 80 feet long, designed with vertical walls that used the mammoth's own 9-ton mass against it. The researchers found at least 14 mammoths at the site, along with evidence that the hunters were using the landscape to funnel the animals toward these specific kill zones. The mammoths didn't die because a human was stronger, they died because a human understood gravity better than they did. The invisible thread here wasn't a piece of cordage, but the predictable path of a 9-ton giant. There is a third, even more pervasive myth, that only modern humans, our own species, were smart enough to engineer these kinds of systems. For decades, we've looked at Neanderthals as thugs with clubs, incapable of the forward thinking required for complex trapping, but recent archaeological finds have shredded that narrative. At the site of Königsau in Germany, researchers found pieces of birch pitch, a high-tech adhesive that dates back over 120,000 years. To make this pitch, Neanderthals had to perform dry distillation, heating birch bark in a vacuum-sealed environment at a precise temperature for hours. This is a chemical engineering process. Why would they go to that much trouble? Because that adhesive was the glue that held their mechanical triggers together. You don't invest in industrial-grade chemical production just to tip a spear. You do it to create triggers that won't slip, traps that can stay set for days in the rain, and invisible threads that don't snap under tension. Neanderthals weren't just hunters. They were chemists and engineers who understood that the best way to win a fight was to make sure the fight was over before it even started. The fourth myth we need to burn down is the image of the solitary trapper sitting by a campfire, carving a single stick. While individual traps were common, the most devastatingly effective ancient traps were megastructures, massive, landscape-altering projects that required generations of communal labor. In the deserts of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Armenia, there are structures called desert kites. From the ground, they just look like low, crumbling stone walls. But from the air, or from a modern satellite, they reveal themselves as enormous funnels, sometimes stretching for miles across the desert. These walls were built to exploit the invisible thread of animal psychology. When a herd of gazelles is spooked, they won't jump over a wall, even a low one. They will run alongside it, following the path of least resistance. The hunters would drive thousands of animals into the wide mouth of the kite, and the walls would gradually narrow, funneling the entire herd into a small, enclosed pit where they could be harvested with zero risk to the hunters. Rémi Crassard and a team of researchers in 2023 published a study showing that these kites are among the oldest large-scale stone structures in human history, some dating back 9,000 years. This wasn't a primitive way to get food. This was a continental-scale slaughterhouse that functioned like a massive stone-walled machine. Even when we look at the water, the myths continue. We imagine ancient fishing as a guy with a bone hook or a sharpened stick waiting patiently by a river. But the reality was much more like an industrial operation. In Australia, the Budge Bim cultural landscape contains a series of eel traps and stone channels built by the Gunditjmara people over 6,600 years ago. They didn't just catch fish, they re-engineered the entire volcanic landscape to create an artificial wetland that functioned as a giant self-sustaining trap. They used the invisible thread of the tides and the seasonal rains to guide eels into specific holding pens. This is the definition of high-level environmental engineering. It's not hunting and gathering in the way we usually mean it. It's the construction of a permanent biological machine that provides food on demand. The trap wasn't a tool they used. The trap was the place where they lived. The fifth myth is that traps were only used for food. This completely misses the psychological warfare aspect of ancient engineering. Traps were the first automated security systems. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia and the forests of North America, ancient people used tripline traps, not just for deer but for other humans. They used the same invisible thread of a tensioned sapling, but instead of a snare, they might rig a deadfall of sharpened bamboo or a swinging log. These devices served as silent sentries, protecting a village's perimeter 24/7 without requiring a single guard to stay awake. The logic was the same: store potential energy in a bent tree, lock it with a hair trigger notch, and wait for the enemy to provide the kinetic energy needed to release it. This was the birth of autonomous weaponry. It was the first time a human being could project lethal force across time and space, killing an intruder while the shooter was miles away, perhaps having a meal or playing with their children. To understand why all of this matters, we have to look at what's actually happening inside a trap. Every trap, from the simplest snare to the most complex desert kite, is built on a unifying truth that defines the human species. A trap is a bet on the future. When you set a trap, you are making a specific scientific prediction about how the world will behave in your absence. You are saying, I predict that a rabbit will walk exactly here, at exactly this height, with exactly this much force, within the next 24 hours. To make that prediction, you have to have a deep, almost spiritual understanding of the biology of your prey. You have to know what it smells, what it fears, and what it desires. You have to be able to see the world through the eyes of another species. This is why the invisible thread is such a powerful metaphor for our development. The thread is the connection between our mind and the physical world. When an ancient hunter tied a noose made of sinew to a bent sapling, they were literally packaging their own intelligence and leaving it behind in the woods. The trap is a proxy for the human brain. It is the moment we stopped being just another animal in the food chain and became the architects of the food chain itself. We didn't move to the top of the pyramid because we were the best at killing. We moved to the top because we were the only ones who figured out how to make the pyramid kill for us. Think about the physics of a snare for a moment. It is one of the most elegant examples of energy storage in history. You take a young, springy tree, a sapling, and you bend it down toward the earth. In doing so, you are performing work. You are taking the chemical energy in your muscles, derived from the food you ate yesterday, and you are converting it into potential elastic energy stored in the fibers of the wood. The tree wants to snap back. It is straining with a force that might be 3 or 4 times greater than your own arm strength. But you hold it there with a tiny, delicate trigger, a sear carved into a piece of bone. This is a force multiplier. You have created a situation where a tiny input, a rabbit's foot, triggers a massive output, the tree snapping up. This is the exact same principle behind the transistor in your smartphone or the fuel injector in your car. It is the control of a large amount of energy with a very small amount of information. The invisible thread isn't just the string, it's the information itself. The unifying truth that ties all these myths together is that the history of human technology isn't a history of better hammers or sharper knives, it's a history of better triggers. From the moment a Neanderthal distilled birch pitch to make a better glue for a trap, To the moment a modern engineer designed a sensor for a self-driving car, we have been obsessed with the same thing. How do we make the world respond to us automatically? We didn't invent technology in the Industrial Revolution. We were already an industrial species 70,000 years ago. Our factories were just made of wood, stone, and animal gut. We were already automating our lives when we were still living in caves. This is why the spear-chasing hero myth is so dangerous. It makes us think that our success was about grit and muscle. But grit and muscle are common in the animal kingdom. A leopard has grit. A bear has muscle. What they don't have is the invisible thread. They can't build a machine that hunts for them while they sleep. They can't project their will into the future. They are trapped in the now, while humans have always lived in the next. Every trap we've ever built is a monument to that fact. Let's look at another specific example that the simple caveman narrative can't explain. The wolf-kill bone shard trap used by Arctic hunters for millennia. This is a psychological trap that uses the animal's own biology as the trigger. The hunter takes a long, thin piece of whalebone, sharpens both ends to a needle point, and then coils it up like a spring. They tie it into this coiled position with a piece of sinew and then encase the whole thing in a ball of frozen fat. They leave this bait out on the ice. A wolf comes along, smells the fat, and swallows the ball whole. Once the fat enters the wolf's stomach, it begins to melt. The invisible thread here is the wolf's own body heat. As the fat melts, the sinew holding the bone spring dissolves, and the whalebone snaps open inside the wolf's stomach. There is no external machine, no hole in the ground, and no hunter within 10 miles. The trap is purely internal, purely biological, and purely devastating. This is biochemical engineering practiced by people who supposedly didn't know what a chemical was. But they knew how heat works, they knew how tension works, and they knew how wolves work. When you start to see the world this way, you realize that our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were programming the environment. They looked at a forest not as a collection of trees, but as a collection of potential levers, springs, and weights. They looked at a river not as a source of water, but as a conveyor belt of calories that could be diverted with the right stone walls. This level of environmental manipulation is so complete that we often don't even recognize it as technology today. We walk past an ancient stone wall in the desert and think it's just a ruin, when in reality it was a high-performance engine for turning gazelles into protein. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable part of the invisible thread reality. Once you realize that our entire history is built on the logic of the trap, you have to start looking at our modern world through that same lens. We haven't stopped building traps, we've just changed what we're catching. Our modern world is an infinite web of invisible threads. When you click a link on your phone, you are triggering a digital sear. When you walk through an automatic door, you are tripping a light-based snare. We have surrounded ourselves with a mechanical environment that responds to our presence exactly like the figure 4 deadfall responded to the mouse. The unifying truth is that a human being is an animal that builds logic into the landscape. Whether it's a mammoth pit in Mexico, a fish weir in Australia, or a desert kite in Jordan, we have always been the species that refuses to play the game by the rules of the animal kingdom. We don't outrun the deer, we make the deer run into a wall that we built 3 generations ago. We don't outfight the mammoth, we let the mammoth fight the gravity of a vertical hole. The invisible thread is the defining characteristic of our genus. It is the reason we are the only species that can live in the Sahara, the Arctic, and the moon. We don't adapt our bodies to the environment. We trap the environment and force it to adapt to us. So, when we ask, how did ancient human traps work? The answer isn't with sticks and strings. The answer is with the future. They worked by colonizing tomorrow. They worked by recognizing that a small amount of thought today is worth more than 1,000 miles of running tomorrow. They worked because our ancestors were the first creatures to realize that you don't have to be the strongest thing in the woods if you're the one who understands how the woods are put together. We have this deep-seated need to believe in the heroic hunter because it makes us feel powerful. It makes us feel like we earned our spot at the top through some kind of glorious physical struggle. But the invisible thread tells a different story. It tells a story of patience, of quiet observation, and of a cold, calculated engineering that is much more human than any spear throw could ever be. It's the story of a species that realized very early on that the most lethal weapon in existence isn't a blade, it's a system. Think about that the next time you look at a simple mechanical device in your own home. Think about the twitch-up snare when you use a stapler. Think about the figure 4 when you see a mousetrap. Think about the desert kite when you see the layout of a modern supermarket, designed to funnel you toward the kill zone of the checkout aisle, using the same path of least resistance psychology that worked on gazelles 9,000 years ago. The tools have changed, the materials have changed, but the invisible thread is exactly the same as it was when the first Neanderthal sat down to distill birch bark into glue. The real how of ancient traps wasn't about the mechanics of the wood, it was about the mechanics of the mind. It was the discovery that you could separate the act of hunting from the moment of the kill. Once that separation happened, the world belonged to us. We became the ghosts in the machine of the natural world, the invisible presence that could strike from anywhere at any time. We didn't just hunt the world, we designed it to be hunted. Everything you've been taught about the struggle for survival suggests that it's a constant, exhausting battle of strength against strength. But that's the final and biggest myth of all. The truth is much more efficient. The truth is that we didn't survive by fighting the world, we survived by setting it. We are not the apex predator because we have the sharpest teeth or the fastest legs. We are the apex predator because we are the only ones who know how to tie a knot. Now, take another look at that plastic container in your kitchen, or the knot in your shoelace, or the latch on your door. You aren't just looking at modern conveniences. You are looking at the sharpened edge of a 100,000-year-old brain. You're looking at the same tension, the same friction, and the same invisible thread that brought down mammoths and built empires. The world around you isn't just a place where you live. It is a massive, complex, interlocking series of triggers that your ancestors spent millennia perfecting. And the most terrifying thing about those triggers is how well they still work. In the end, there was no great heroic struggle for the top of the food chain. There was just a long, quiet process of trial and error, of carving notches into sticks and testing the tension of sinew. The mammoth didn't die in a blaze of glory. It died because it stepped on a patch of grass that wasn't actually there. It died because it was playing a game of physical strength in a world that had already been rewritten by human logic. And that is the most important lesson of the ancient traps. In a world governed by the invisible thread, the strongest player isn't the one who can hit the hardest. It's the one who knows exactly where you're going to be standing tomorrow morning. You might like to think you're different from those gazelles in the desert kite, or that mammoth in the Mexican pit, but you're still following the same lines of least resistance every single day. You're still clicking the links, walking the paths, and snapping the lids that someone else designed for you. We haven't escaped the traps. We've just moved into them and started calling them home. After all, the most successful trap in history isn't the one that kills the animal, it's the one that makes the animal think it's finally safe. If you want to see more deep dives into the secret history of the things we take for granted, you know what to do. But remember, every time you hear that little click in your daily life, you're not just hearing a machine work. You're hearing the echo of the very first time a human being walked away from a hunt and let the world do the work for them. You aren't a pursuit predator, you are a master of the invisible thread. And whether you realize it or not, the trap is already set.